On the evening of March 4th, 1949, at approximately 6:47 p.m., FBI Special Agent Robert Joseph Lamphere stood on the northwest corner of East 15th Street and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan, watching two figures emerge from the subway station across the street. The temperature that evening was 34 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that most pedestrians walked quickly with their coat collars turned up against the wind that swept through the city's corridors of buildings. Lamphere, 29 years old, had been assigned to the FBI's New York field office for 2 years, working primarily on Soviet counterintelligence operations. The surveillance he was conducting that evening was the culmination of an investigation that had begun 4 months earlier, in November 1948, and involved one of the most sensitive compromises of classified information the Bureau had encountered since the end of World War II, a case that would become one of the most controversial espionage prosecutions in American history. Before we continue with how this case unfolded, if you're interested in the real documented stories behind Cold War espionage and the human cost of intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these forgotten cases every week, backed by historical records and declassified documents. Now let's follow how the FBI identified Judith Coplon and built their case against her. The woman who emerged from the subway was Judith Coplon, 28 years old, an analyst employed by the United States Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark brown hair that she wore shoulder length, and she was dressed that evening in a gray wool coat, black gloves, and low-heeled shoes suitable for walking. The man who walked beside her, maintaining a distance of roughly 2 feet as they moved north along 3rd Avenue, was Valentin Gubitchev, 33 years old, an engineer by training who held the position of architect and planning specialist with the United Nations Secretariat's Division of Building and Planning. Gubitchev was 6 feet tall, solidly built, with receding dark hair and sharp features. He wore a dark overcoat, a gray fedora, and leather gloves. Lamphere had been tracking Coplan's movements for 16 weeks. During that time, FBI agents had documented 23 separate trips she had made from Washington to New York City, always on weekends or during periods when she had taken annual leave from her Justice Department position. The pattern of these trips, combined with intercepted Soviet communications and information developed from other sources, had led FBI counterintelligence analysts to conclude that Coplan was engaged in espionage, specifically that she was providing classified information to Soviet intelligence through a handler operating in New York. What the FBI did not know until surveillance operations conducted during late February 1949 was the identity of that handler. On February 18, 1949, during Coplan's previous trip to New York, FBI agents had observed her meeting with Gubitchev near the Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side. The two had walked together through Central Park for roughly 40 minutes, stopping twice to sit on benches despite the cold weather. Their behavior suggested more than a casual acquaintance. They walked close together, occasionally touching, and appeared to be engaged in intense conversation. FBI agents photographed the encounter from various positions and documented the meeting in detailed surveillance logs. Valentin Gubitchev had come to the attention of U.S. intelligence services shortly after his arrival in the United States in August 1946. He had traveled to New York with his wife, Lydia, aboard the Soviet passenger ship Smolny, arriving at the port of New York on August 23rd. His official assignment was to work as an architect on planning and construction projects for the United Nations, which was then establishing its permanent headquarters in New York City. The UN Secretariat, as an international organization, employed staff from member nations and Soviet citizens working for the UN were theoretically neutral international civil servants rather than representatives of the Soviet government. In practice, however, U.S. intelligence agencies understood that the Soviet Union used UN positions as cover for intelligence officers. The diplomatic immunity and freedom of movement that came with UN employment made such positions ideal for espionage operations. FBI files on Soviet intelligence activities in the United States identified nearly 40% of Soviet nationals employed by the UN as suspected intelligence officers operating under cover of their official positions. The UN's international status provided these officers with legitimate reasons to travel throughout the New York metropolitan area to maintain contact with various people without arousing suspicion, and to claim diplomatic privileges that would complicate any law enforcement action against them. Gubitchev's background suggested he was likely more than a simple architect. Bureau files indicated that Gubitchev had previously worked in Moscow for Intourist, the Soviet state tourism agency, which was known to be used as cover employment for intelligence officers. He had also worked, according to some reports, for the Soviet Trade Mission, another organization frequently used to provide cover for intelligence operations abroad. The FBI's assessment, documented in classified memoranda circulated within the Bureau's Soviet counterintelligence section, was that Gubitchev was likely affiliated with the KGB, specifically with the organization's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, which was responsible for recruiting and handling agents in foreign countries. Judith Coplan's path to that subway station on East 15th Street had begun in circumstances that appeared entirely ordinary and patriotic. She had been born on January 1, 1921, in New York City, the daughter of Samuel Coplan, a toy manufacturer, and Rebecca Coplan, a homemaker. The family was Jewish and lived in a comfortable apartment in the Bronx. Judith had been an academically gifted student. Graduating from James Monroe High School in 1938 at the age of 17, and then attending Barnard College, the women's college affiliated with Columbia University. At Barnard, Coplan had majored in history and international relations. She graduated in 1943, during the height of World War II, and sought employment in government service. In June 1943, she was hired by the U.S. Department of Justice as a junior analyst in the Economic Warfare section. Her responsibilities involved analyzing intelligence reports related to economic conditions in Axis countries and occupied territories. The work required a security clearance at the confidential level, which she received after a routine background investigation found no concerns about her loyalty or reliability. Coplan's work performance was consistently rated as excellent. She was described by supervisors as intelligent, detail-oriented, and capable of producing thorough analytical reports. In 1945, following the end of the war, she was reassigned to the Justice Department's Foreign Agents Registration section, where her responsibilities included monitoring the activities of foreign agents and organizations operating in the United States. This position required an upgraded security clearance at the secret level, which she received in October 1945. What none of her supervisors or colleagues knew was that Judith Coplon had, during her time at Barnard College, developed political views that were sympathetic to communism. Declassified FBI files and information developed from various sources indicate that Coplan had attended meetings of left-wing student organizations during her college years and had maintained contact with individuals who were members of or sympathetic to the Communist Party USA. These associations were not unusual for college students in the 1930s and early 1940s, when leftist political movements had attracted many young intellectuals concerned about economic inequality, fascism, and social justice. The FBI's investigation would eventually determine that Coplan had been recruited by Soviet intelligence sometime in late 1944 or early 1945. The exact circumstances of her recruitment were never definitively established, but the most likely scenario, based on patterns observed in other cases, was that she had been approached by a talent spotter, someone who identified individuals with access to valuable information and appropriate political sympathies, and had been gradually cultivated and recruited through a series of seemingly innocent social contacts. By early 1945, Bureau analysis suggests Coplan was providing information to Soviet intelligence handlers. Her position in the Justice Department's Economic Warfare section gave her access to intelligence reports from various government agencies, including the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Army's intelligence services. These reports contained information about suspected Axis agents, economic conditions in Europe, and intelligence assessments related to post-war planning. In November 1948, the FBI's cryptanalysis program, an extremely highly classified effort to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications, had produced information suggesting that someone in the Justice Department with access to FBI reports was providing information to Soviet intelligence. The decrypted communications did not identify the individual by name, but provided enough detail about the person's access and responsibilities to narrow the field of potential suspects. Judith Coplon matched the profile suggested by the decrypted communications. She had access to FBI reports on suspected foreign agents. She worked in a section that handled exactly the type of information referenced in the Soviet communications, and routine security reviews of her background had found that she had maintained contact with several individuals known to be associated with communist organizations, though this in itself was not considered sufficient grounds for suspicion in 1948, when thousands of government employees had similar associations. The FBI made the decision to place Coplan under intensive surveillance. Beginning in late November 1948, agents documented her movements, her contacts, and her activities both at work and during her personal time. They also implemented what would later become controversial. They began feeding her false information, planting fabricated FBI reports in the files she had access to in order to determine whether these false reports would appear in Soviet intelligence communications. By January 1949, the FBI's surveillance had documented Coplan's pattern of weekend trips to New York. She would typically leave Washington on Friday evening, taking a train to New York's Pennsylvania station, and would return to Washington on Sunday evening or Monday morning. In New York, she stayed with her family in the Bronx. The FBI documented her movements during these visits through physical surveillance. Agents followed her on foot and by vehicle as she traveled around the city. On several occasions during January and early February 1949, FBI agents observed Coplan engaged in what appeared to be counter-surveillance activity. She would exit a subway station, walk a block, then suddenly reverse direction. She would enter a department store through one entrance and exit through another. She would board a bus, ride for 2 or 3 stops, exit, and then board another bus traveling in the opposite direction. These techniques were consistent with training in detecting and evading surveillance, and they suggested that Coplan was aware she might be watched and was taking active steps to determine whether she was being followed. The identification of Gubitchev as Coplan's contact on February 18, 1949, had been a significant breakthrough. FBI agents had photographed the two walking together in Central Park and had documented their meeting with sufficient detail to establish that they had a relationship beyond casual acquaintance. Subsequent investigation into Gubitchev's background and activities reinforced the assessment that he was a Soviet intelligence officer. On March 4, 1949, Judith Coplon had left Washington at 4:37 p.m. on a Pennsylvania Railroad train bound for New York. FBI agents had been on the train, maintaining surveillance. When the train arrived at Pennsylvania Station at roughly 7:50 p.m., agents followed Coplan as she took a subway to 14th Street. At about 8:15 p.m., she met Gubitchev near Union Square. The two walked together south along 3rd Avenue, stopping occasionally as if window shopping or simply talking. FBI. Special Agent Lamphere and his team followed at distances ranging from 25 to 100 yards, with multiple agents positioned at different points to maintain visual contact while avoiding detection. At around 8:47 p.m., Coplan and Gubitchev entered a restaurant on 3rd Avenue near 10th Street. They sat in a booth toward the back of the establishment. FBI agents positioned themselves at tables where they could observe the two subjects without being conspicuous. According to surveillance logs, Coplan and Gubitchev remained in the restaurant for roughly 35 minutes. They ordered coffee and appeared to be engaged in conversation. At one point, Coplan reached into her purse and withdrew what appeared to be papers, which she showed to Gubitchev. The FBI agents could not see the papers clearly enough to identify them, but the action was consistent with the transfer of documents. At about 9:22 p.m., Coplan and Gubitchev left the restaurant and began walking north. They walked close together, occasionally touching. The surveillance continued. On East 15th Street near 3rd Avenue, at around 9:34 p.m., FBI agents, under orders from senior officials who had determined that sufficient evidence of espionage had been documented, moved in to make arrests. Special Agent Lamphere approached from one direction, while other agents moved in from opposite angles. According to Lamphere's subsequent report, he identified himself as an FBI agent and informed both Coplan and Gubitchev that they were under arrest. Coplan's immediate response was shock. She appeared genuinely surprised and began to ask what the arrest was for. Gubitchev's response was different. Agent reports indicate he remained calm, said nothing, and immediately reached into his coat pocket. The agents, concerned that he might be reaching for a weapon or might be attempting to destroy evidence, physically restrained Gubitchev and removed his hands from his pockets. A subsequent search revealed that Gubitchev had been carrying in his coat pocket several folded papers. These papers would later be identified as handwritten notes containing information about FBI investigations and organizational structure. Coplan was carrying a purse. When agents searched it at the scene, they found a collection of papers that included what appeared to be FBI data slips, small index card-sized documents that FBI agents used to record information about individuals under investigation. These slips contained names, addresses, and brief descriptions of investigative activity. According to later forensic analysis, many of these data slips contained information from current FBI counterintelligence investigations into suspected Soviet intelligence activities. Both Coplan and Gubitchev were transported to the FBI's New York field office at 201 East 69th Street. They were placed in separate interview rooms and advised of their rights. Coplan, after initially appearing cooperative and asking what the arrest was about, requested an attorney and refused to make any statement. Gubitchev, through an attorney who arrived roughly 2 hours after his arrest, claimed diplomatic immunity as a UN employee and refused to answer questions. The question of Gubitchev's diplomatic status became immediately contentious. Under the agreement between the United States and the United Nations regarding the UN's headquarters in New York, UN employees were granted certain immunities and privileges designed to protect the organization's independence and allow it to function effectively. However, these immunities were not absolute. The agreement specified that immunity did not apply to criminal acts that were unrelated to official UN functions, and it allowed the U.S. government to declare UN employees persona non grata and require their departure from the country. The U.S. Department of Justice, in consultation with the State Department, determined that Gubitchev's alleged espionage activities were not protected by UN immunity and that he could be prosecuted under U.S. law. The Soviet Union vehemently disagreed, arguing that Gubitchev was a legitimate UN employee performing official functions and that his arrest violated international agreements. The Soviet government demanded his immediate release and threatened diplomatic consequences if he was not freed. On March 7, 1949, 3 days after their arrests, both Coplan and Gubitchev were formally charged in federal court in the Southern District of New York with conspiracy to commit espionage. The charges specified that they had conspired to obtain and transmit to the Soviet Union documents and information relating to the national defense of the United States in violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. The evidence against them appeared overwhelming. In addition to the documents found in their possession at the time of arrest, FBI analysts had compiled extensive surveillance logs documenting their meetings, their counter-surveillance activities, and their possession of classified information. The decrypted Soviet communications, while not admissible as evidence due to their classification, had provided the investigative framework that led to identifying Coplan as a suspect. The arrests generated significant media attention. The case came at a time of heightened public concern about Soviet espionage and communist infiltration of the U.S. government. The arrest of a Justice Department employee with access to FBI counterintelligence information seemed to confirm fears about the extent of Soviet penetration of the government. Coplan's family retained attorney Archie Palmer to represent her. Palmer was an experienced criminal defense attorney based in Washington, D.C., known for his aggressive courtroom tactics and his willingness to take on difficult cases. His strategy in defending Coplan would center on several arguments. First, that the FBI had conducted illegal searches and surveillance without proper warrants. Second, that the documents found in Coplan's possession had not been stolen but had been legitimately obtained as part of her work duties. And third, that the government's evidence was circumstantial and did not prove criminal intent. Gubitchev was represented initially by Soviet government attorneys, but after the Soviet Union's protests about his arrest failed to secure his release, private counsel was retained. His defense strategy was primarily to challenge the government's jurisdiction, arguing that as a UN employee, he could not be prosecuted in U.S. courts for activities related to his official duties. The trial began on April 25, 1949, in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, before Judge Sylvester J. Ryan. The prosecution was handled by Assistant U.S. Attorney John M. Kelly, Jr., an experienced prosecutor who had previously handled several espionage cases. The trial would last 6 weeks and would involve testimony from more than 50 witnesses. The government's case proceeded methodically. FBI agents testified about the surveillance operations that had documented Coplan's meetings with Gubitchev. They described the counter-surveillance techniques both defendants had employed, the locations where they had met, and the circumstances of their arrest. FBI document examiners testified that the data slips found in Coplan's purse contained information that was classified and that had been obtained from FBI files to which Coplan had access through her work at the Justice Department. The defense challenged every element of the government's case. Palmer argued that the FBI's surveillance of Coplan had been conducted without warrants and therefore violated her Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. He pointed out that FBI agents had followed Coplan across state lines, had monitored her movements constantly, and had even intercepted her telephone calls without judicial authorization. Judge Ryan ruled that the surveillance had been lawful, finding that the FBI had sufficient cause to believe Coplan was engaged in espionage and that the exigent circumstances of national security justified the warrantless surveillance. This ruling would later become controversial and would be challenged on appeal. Palmer also challenged the government's characterization of the documents found in Coplan's possession. He argued that Coplan had legitimately obtained these documents as part of her work responsibilities, that she had not stolen them, and that her possession of them did not constitute espionage. The government countered by presenting evidence that Coplan had removed the documents from Justice Department offices without authorization, that she had concealed them in her purse, and that she had been in the process of transferring them to Gubitchev when arrested. One of the most dramatic moments in the trial came when the government presented testimony from FBI codebreakers about the decrypted Soviet communications. The very existence of the U.S. government's ability to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications was among the most closely guarded secrets of the era. The program, which would eventually be known publicly as Venona, had begun during World War II and had achieved significant success in reading Soviet intelligence messages sent to and from Soviet diplomatic facilities in the United States. The government wanted to introduce evidence derived from these decryptions to show that Soviet intelligence had an agent in the Justice Department who matched Coplan's profile and responsibilities. However, exposing the existence of the code-breaking program in open court would alert the Soviets that their communications were being read and would likely lead them to change their codes and communications procedures, rendering years of cryptanalytic work useless. The government's solution was to present heavily redacted and sanitized versions of the information, testifying only that intelligence sources had indicated the presence of a Soviet agent in the Justice Department without revealing how that intelligence had been obtained. Judge Ryan allowed this testimony over defense objections, ruling that the government had legitimate national security interests in protecting its intelligence sources and methods. Judith Coplon took the stand in her own defense. Over 3 days of testimony, she denied being a Soviet agent, denied that she had provided classified information to Gubitchev or anyone else, and offered alternative explanations for the evidence against her. She testified that she had met Gubitchev through mutual friends in 1948, that they had developed a personal relationship that was romantic in nature, and that their meetings in New York had been personal rather than operational. Regarding the documents found in her purse, Coplan testified that she had taken them home to work on over the weekend, which was a common practice among Justice Department employees who needed to complete projects outside normal working hours. She acknowledged that this might have been a violation of security protocols, but insisted it was not espionage. The government's cross-examination of Coplan focused on inconsistencies in her testimony and on behavior that contradicted her explanation. If her meetings with Gubitchev were romantic in nature, why had she employed counter-surveillance techniques to detect whether she was being followed? If she had taken documents home merely to work on them, why had she been showing them to Gubitchev in a restaurant? If her relationship with Gubitchev was innocent, why had neither of them told friends, family, or colleagues about it? Coplan's answers to these questions were often evasive or unconvincing. She claimed that the counter-surveillance activities were merely habits she had developed from reading detective novels and from general awareness of security concerns. She said she had shown documents to Gubitchev because he had expressed academic interest in American law enforcement, and she was trying to impress him. She explained the secrecy of their relationship by saying that she had not wanted her family to know she was dating someone who was already married Gubitchev's wife, Lydia, had returned to the Soviet Union in 1947, but technically the marriage still existed. Valentin Gubitchev did not testify. His attorneys advised him to invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and he remained silent throughout the trial. The government was therefore unable to cross-examine him, or to challenge directly his claim that he was merely a UN architect engaged in a personal relationship with Coplan. On July 30, 1949, after deliberating for roughly 24 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both defendants on all counts. The verdicts came as no surprise to anyone who had followed the trial. The evidence of espionage, the classified documents, the clandestine meetings, the counter-surveillance techniques, the lies and evasions, had been too substantial to overcome with alternative explanations. Judge Ryan scheduled sentencing for August 1, 1949. The Espionage Act allowed for sentences ranging from significant prison terms to, in extreme cases, the death penalty. However, prosecutors indicated they would not seek the death penalty for either defendant, given that the information compromised, while significant, did not rise to the level of vital national defense secrets like atomic bomb designs, and given that the espionage had been detected before massive damage could occur. Between the conviction and sentencing, diplomatic negotiations intensified regarding Gubitchev's status. The Soviet Union maintained its position that Gubitchev's prosecution violated international agreements and demanded that the conviction be overturned and Gubitchev be released. The U.S. government refused, insisting that Gubitchev had engaged in criminal espionage activities that were not protected by any diplomatic or UN immunity. However, behind the scenes, both governments recognized that Gubitchev's continued presence in U.S. custody created complications. The Soviets had other intelligence officers operating in the United States under diplomatic cover, and a precedent that allowed for the arrest and prosecution of UN employees could potentially be applied to them as well. The U.S. government, for its part, was concerned about potential Soviet retaliation against American diplomats or UN employees in Moscow or in other countries. The solution that emerged was a compromise. Gubitchev would be allowed to serve a token sentence and would then be expelled from the United States. He would return to the Soviet Union, effectively ending his intelligence career in America, but allowing both governments to claim a measure of success. On August 1, 1949, Judge Ryan sentenced Judith Coplon to serve 15 years in federal prison. He sentenced Valentin Gubitchev to serve 15 years in federal prison, but indicated that the sentence could be reduced or modified based on diplomatic considerations. Both sentences were to be served at federal penitentiaries, with Coplan to be held at the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia, and Gubitchev at a federal facility to be determined by the Bureau of Prisons. Coplan's attorneys immediately filed appeals, challenging both the conviction and the sentence on multiple grounds. They argued that the FBI's warrantless surveillance had violated Coplan's constitutional rights, that the government had failed to provide adequate discovery of evidence to the defense, and that Judge Ryan had made numerous errors in his evidentiary rulings during the trial. The appeals process would take more than 3 years. During this time, Coplan remained free on bail, a decision that was itself controversial, given that she had been convicted of espionage. Critics argued that allowing a convicted spy to remain at liberty posed a security risk and sent the wrong message about the seriousness of espionage offenses. However, Coplan's attorneys had argued successfully that she posed no flight risk, that she had strong family ties in the United States, and that she deserved the presumption of liberty pending resolution of her appeals. Gubitchev's situation was resolved more quickly. In November 1949, after serving roughly 3 months in federal custody, he was released pursuant to an agreement between the U.S. and Soviet governments. He was immediately deported to the Soviet Union, traveling aboard a Soviet passenger ship that departed from New York Harbor in late November 1949. FBI agents who monitored his departure noted that he was accompanied by Soviet diplomatic personnel and that he showed no emotion as the ship pulled away from the dock. What happened to Gubitchev after his return to the Soviet Union is not well documented in Western sources. Intelligence reports assembled by the CIA and other agencies suggest he returned to Moscow and resumed work as an engineer, though whether he continued to work for Soviet intelligence is unknown. Some reports indicated he was assigned to work on construction projects in Soviet Central Asia. Other reports suggested he worked for Soviet trade organizations. None of these reports could be definitively confirmed. Gubitchev lived in the Soviet Union for the remainder of his life. Soviet records that became accessible after the collapse of the USSR indicate he died in Moscow in 1976 at the age of 60. His obituary in Soviet newspapers identified him as an engineer who had worked on various construction and planning projects, with no mention of his work for the United Nations or his espionage activities. His wife, Lydia, who had returned to the Soviet Union in 1947 before his arrest, survived him. They had no children. For Judith Coplon, the legal battle continued. In December 1950, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit overturned her New York conviction on procedural grounds. The appellate court found that the FBI's warrantless arrest of Coplan had violated her Fourth Amendment rights because agents had not obtained an arrest warrant even though they had sufficient time to do so. The court noted that while the FBI had been conducting surveillance for months and had substantial evidence of espionage, agents could have obtained a warrant from a federal magistrate but had chosen not to do so. The appellate court also found that the trial judge had erred in not requiring the government to provide more detailed disclosure of its investigative methods and evidence to the defense. This finding was significant because it suggested that Coplan had been denied a fair trial due to the government's refusal to share information about its surveillance techniques and intelligence sources. The government initially indicated it would retry Coplan, but complications emerged. The procedural violations identified by the appellate court meant that much of the evidence obtained through warrantless surveillance might not be admissible in a new trial. Furthermore, any retrial would require the government to disclose more information about its intelligence-gathering methods, including potentially the code-breaking operations that had initially identified Coplan as a suspect. The government was unwilling to expose these sources and methods in open court. In January 1951, Coplan was indicted again, this time in federal court in Washington, D.C., on charges related to espionage activities that had occurred in Washington rather than New York. The theory was that a separate prosecution based on different evidence might avoid the procedural problems that had overturned the New York conviction. This second trial began in April 1951 before Judge Albert L. Reeves. The evidence was similar to that presented in the first trial: FBI surveillance logs, testimony about classified documents, expert testimony about espionage tradecraft. In June 1951, Coplan was again convicted. However, this conviction was also appealed, and in 1952, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit overturned it on similar grounds to those that had invalidated the New York conviction: improper FBI surveillance methods and insufficient disclosure of evidence to the defense. The government now faced a difficult decision. 2 convictions had been overturned on procedural grounds. A third prosecution would face the same evidentiary problems, and there was no guarantee of a different outcome. Moreover, the legal landscape was changing. Courts were becoming more protective of defendants' constitutional rights, particularly regarding search and seizure issues, and less willing to defer to government claims about national security. In December 1952, the Department of Justice announced that it would not pursue further prosecutions of Judith Coplon. While the government maintained that the evidence clearly established her guilt, prosecutors acknowledged that the procedural obstacles to a successful conviction were insurmountable without disclosing intelligence sources and methods that could not be revealed without compromising national security. This decision meant that Judith Coplon, despite 2 jury convictions for espionage, would serve no prison time. The outcome was widely criticized by those who believed she had escaped justice due to legal technicalities. Others argued that the government's failure to follow proper procedures had made the convictions vulnerable to reversal, and that law enforcement agencies bore responsibility for not conducting their investigation in a manner that would withstand legal scrutiny. For Coplan, the immediate consequence was freedom from criminal liability, but the broader consequences of her espionage prosecution would follow her for decades. She had lost her job at the Justice Department immediately after her arrest. Her security clearance was revoked, making her unemployable in any position involving access to classified information or government work. Her name was permanently associated with Soviet espionage, and despite the overturned convictions, most people who knew anything about the case believed she had been guilty. In 1953, Coplan married Albert H. Sokolov, an attorney she had met through mutual friends. The couple settled in New York City, where Sokolov practiced law, and Coplan eventually found work in the restaurant and catering industry, far removed from the government work that had once been her career. They had 4 children together over the following decade. Those who knew Coplan during these years described her as rarely discussing the espionage case and apparently wanting to move past it and build a normal life. She was described as a devoted mother, active in her children's schools, and engaged in community activities. She and her husband maintained a comfortable middle-class existence, though they never achieved significant wealth. Coplan consistently maintained her innocence. In occasional interviews she gave to journalists over the years, she insisted that she had been framed, that the FBI had fabricated evidence against her, and that her relationship with Gubitchev had been personal rather than operational. She argued that she had been targeted because of her political views and her associations with left-wing organizations during her college years, and that the espionage charges had been a pretext for persecution. These claims were not credible to intelligence professionals or historians who examined the evidence. The documents found in her possession at the time of her arrest, the surveillance evidence documenting her meetings with Gubitchev, the counter-surveillance techniques she employed, and the patterns of her behavior all pointed convincingly to espionage activity. The FBI's procedural violations that led to her convictions being overturned did not change the fundamental facts of what she had done. Moreover, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, researchers gained access to KGB archives that included some records related to American agents. While many files had been destroyed or remained classified, enough information emerged to confirm that Coplan had indeed been a Soviet intelligence asset during the period in question. KGB documents referred to her by a code name and documented payments made to her, meetings with her handler, and information she had provided. The question of why Judith Coplon became a Soviet spy has no simple answer. She grew up in a comfortable, patriotic American family. She had no apparent financial pressures that might have motivated her to sell secrets for money. The modest payments she received from Soviet intelligence, probably no more than a few $1,000s over several years, could not have been her primary motivation. The most likely explanation, based on what is known about her political views and her associations during college, is that she was motivated primarily by ideology. During the 1930s and early 1940s, many young intellectuals were attracted to communist ideals and saw the Soviet Union as representing progressive values in opposition to fascism and capitalism. Coplan appears to have been among this group, and when approached by Soviet intelligence, she rationalized providing classified information as serving a higher cause, helping the Soviet Union, which she viewed as a force for social justice, to defend itself against what she saw as American aggression and imperialism. This ideological motivation was common among American citizens who spied for the Soviet Union during this period. They genuinely believed they were helping to create a better world, that the Soviet Union represented the future of humanity, and that any damage to U.S. national security was justified by the larger goal of advancing communist ideals. Only later, as the reality of Soviet repression, totalitarianism, and aggression became undeniable, did some of these individuals come to regret their actions. Others, like Coplan, never publicly acknowledged regret and continued to maintain that their actions had been justified or that they had never engaged in espionage at all. For the FBI, the Coplan case represented both a significant success and a significant failure. The success was in identifying a Soviet agent operating within the U.S. government, documenting her espionage activities, and disrupting her operation. The failure was in conducting the investigation in a manner that ultimately allowed her to avoid punishment due to procedural violations. The case led to reforms in FBI procedures for surveillance, evidence collection, and coordination with prosecutors to ensure that investigations would produce legally admissible evidence. The case also contributed to broader concerns about Soviet penetration of the U.S. government that would intensify during the early 1950s. The fact that a Justice Department employee with access to FBI counterintelligence information had been able to operate as a Soviet agent for several years suggested that security procedures were inadequate and that other spies might be operating undetected. These concerns would feed into the anti-communist investigations conducted by Senator Joseph McCarthy and others, though the excesses and false accusations that characterized that period went far beyond legitimate security concerns. For the Justice Department, the Coplan case prompted a comprehensive review of security procedures, particularly regarding employees' access to classified information. New protocols were implemented requiring more frequent security reviews, more rigorous background investigations, and stricter controls on who could access FBI reports and other sensitive materials. The information that Coplan provided to Soviet intelligence compromised multiple FBI counterintelligence investigations. Bureau damage assessment reports from April 1950 indicate she had provided information that allowed Soviet intelligence to identify and protect several of its agents operating in the United States. FBI investigations that had been close to uncovering these agents were disrupted when the Soviets, warned by information from Coplan, instructed their agents to change their operational procedures or to cease operations temporarily. The full extent of the damage may never be known. Intelligence operations involve layers of sources, methods, and analysis that can be disrupted in ways that are difficult to trace. An investigation that goes cold because a suspect changes their behavior might be attributed to chance, when in fact it resulted from a warning based on compromised information. An agent who escapes detection might do so because timely intelligence allowed them to cover their tracks. The Coplan case affected U.S. counterintelligence operations in ways that continued to have consequences for years after her arrest. Judith Coplon lived quietly in New York City for the remainder of her life. She worked in her husband's law office, helped manage a restaurant, and was active in her children's lives. Family members and friends described her as intensely private about her past and prone to anger when the subject of the espionage case was raised. She granted occasional interviews to journalists and historians, but these interviews typically covered little new ground and consisted mainly of her insisting on her innocence. Albert H. Sokoloff, Coplan's husband, died in 1995. Coplan herself lived until February 26, 2011, when she died at the age of 89 in a nursing home in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Her obituary in the New York Times briefly mentioned the espionage case, but focused primarily on her later life as a wife, mother, and business owner. None of her 4 children agreed to be interviewed about their mother's espionage activities, maintaining the privacy that had characterized the family's approach to the subject for decades. The question of what effect Coplan's espionage activities and legal troubles had on her children is difficult to answer, as the family maintained strict privacy. Unlike some espionage cases where the children of convicted spies have spoken publicly about growing up in the shadow of their parents' crimes, Coplan's children remained silent. Growing up as the child of a person accused of espionage, even if never ultimately convicted, carried significant social and psychological burdens. Coplan's children would have grown up knowing that their mother had been tried for treason, that many people believed she was guilty regardless of the overturned convictions, and that their family name was associated with Soviet espionage. They would have faced questions from classmates, neighbors, and later from colleagues and potential employers about their mother's past. The broader significance of the Coplan-Gubitchev case lies in what it revealed about Soviet intelligence operations during the early Cold War period and about the challenges facing U.S. counterintelligence. The case demonstrated that the Soviet Union was actively conducting espionage operations against the United States, that these operations had succeeded in placing agents within the U.S. government, and that detecting and prosecuting these agents presented significant legal and operational challenges. The case also illustrated the trade-offs between security and civil liberties that would characterize counterintelligence work throughout the Cold War. The FBI's surveillance of Coplan had been extensive, intrusive, and conducted without judicial oversight. When this surveillance was challenged in court, judges found that it violated constitutional protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. This created a tension between the government's need to detect spies and the individual's rights to privacy and due process, a tension that has never been fully resolved and that continues to generate debate today. From a moral perspective, the Coplan-Gubitchev case presents the same complexities that characterize many espionage cases. Judith Coplon made choices to betray her country, to provide classified information to a foreign intelligence service, and to participate in an operation that compromised U.S. national security. These choices were wrong, and they caused harm that extended beyond abstract damage to national security to include specific FBI investigations that were compromised and specific Soviet agents who escaped detection because of information she provided. Yet Coplan was also a young woman who had developed political convictions during a time of great ideological conflict, who was recruited and manipulated by professional intelligence officers, and who may have genuinely believed that her actions served a higher purpose. She was not a monster, but a human being who made destructive choices based on beliefs that, however misguided, were sincere. She paid a price for those choices: 2 criminal trials, 2 convictions that were overturned, the loss of her career, decades of living with public knowledge of her espionage activities, even though she never served prison time. Valentin Gubitchev was an intelligence officer performing the duties his government assigned him. From the Soviet perspective, He was doing his job, serving his country's interests, and operating in hostile territory where he faced significant personal risk. From the American perspective, he was a spy who had violated U.S. law and who had participated in an operation to steal classified information. Both perspectives are valid within their own frameworks, and neither fully captures the complexity of the situation. The question of responsibility in cases like this requires acknowledging that individuals make choices within systems that shape those choices. Coplan chose to become a Soviet agent, but she made that choice within a context of Cold War tensions, ideological conflict, and Soviet intelligence operations that were designed to identify and exploit individuals like her. Gubitchev chose to work as an intelligence officer, but he made that choice within a Soviet system that valued such service and that provided limited opportunities for individuals to decline assignments that violated their personal ethics, assuming he had such objections. The FBI agents who investigated the case, the prosecutors who brought charges, and the judges who presided over the trials were all operating within legal and institutional frameworks that sometimes conflicted with each other. The agents believed they were protecting national security and were frustrated when procedural rules they viewed as technicalities allowed a guilty person to escape punishment. The judges believed they were protecting constitutional rights and ensuring fair trials, even when this meant overturning convictions of individuals who almost certainly were guilty of the charged crimes. All were acting according to the logic of the systems they inhabited, making choices in difficult circumstances with consequences that extended far beyond what any of them could fully anticipate. The surveillance photographs that helped document Coplan's meetings with Gubitchev, the logs that recorded their counter-surveillance techniques, the documents found in Coplan's purse, these pieces of evidence captured moments in time, fragments of a larger operation that stretched across months and involved multiple people and organizations. But like all evidence, they could only show what happened, not why it happened or what it meant to the people involved. Judith Coplon was 28 years old when she was arrested in March 1949. She was 89 when she died in 2011. The espionage activities that led to her arrest occupied perhaps 3 to 4 years of her life, yet they defined her existence for the following 6 decades. Every news story about Soviet espionage that mentioned her case, every conversation where someone recognized her name, every moment when her children or grandchildren encountered references to their family's history, all of these were consequences that extended far beyond the specific acts of espionage she committed. The question she never answered publicly, and perhaps never fully answered even to herself, was whether it had been worth it. Whether the ideological satisfaction of believing she was helping the Soviet Union, the psychological reward of feeling important and valued by her intelligence handlers, the modest financial payments she received, whether any of these justified the damage to U.S. national security, the compromising of FBI investigations, the loss of her career, the social stigma, the burden placed on her family. What is certain is that espionage creates victims on multiple levels. The most obvious victims are the countries whose security is compromised and the individuals whose investigations or operations are betrayed. But there are also personal victims, family members who bear the shame and consequences of choices they did not make, children who grow up in the shadow of their parents' crimes, spouses who must reconcile their love for someone with knowledge of what that person has done. The Coplan-Gubitchev case was one of many espionage cases during the Cold War, neither the most damaging nor the most notorious. The atomic spy cases, the Rosenbergs, Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, involved more significant security breaches and received more public attention. The CIA mole cases of later decades, Aldrich Ames, Robert Hanssen, caused more substantial damage to intelligence operations and resulted in the deaths of intelligence sources. Yet the Coplan-Gubitchev case represents something important about the nature of Cold War espionage and about the human dimensions of intelligence work. It shows how ordinary people could be drawn into extraordinary activities, how ideological convictions could lead to choices with profound consequences, and how the legal system struggled to balance security imperatives with constitutional protections. The case also illustrates the persistent question that runs through all espionage cases: what leads a person to betray their country? The answer is never simple. It involves some combination of ideology, personal grievances, financial need, psychological vulnerabilities, social connections, and opportunity. In Coplan's case, ideology appears to have been the primary factor, but even that ideological commitment existed within a larger context of personal relationships, professional opportunities, and historical circumstances that made certain choices seem reasonable at the time, even if they later came to appear indefensible. Valentin Gubitchev was 33 when he was arrested and deported. He was 60 when he died in Moscow. In between, he lived a life that is largely unknown to history, working as an engineer, living in a society that had sent him abroad to conduct espionage, and that welcomed him back when that mission failed. Whether he had regrets about his intelligence work, whether he reflected on the consequences of his choices, whether he thought about Judith Coplon and what happened to her, these questions have no documented answers. The espionage operation he participated in achieved some success in obtaining classified information, but was ultimately disrupted before it could cause catastrophic damage. The relationship he developed with Coplan, whether it was purely operational or involved genuine personal feelings, ended with both of them under arrest and facing serious criminal charges. His deployment to the United States, which was supposed to advance his career and serve his country, ended in expulsion and the public revelation of his intelligence activities. The enduring legacy of the Coplan-Gubitchev case is not in any single dramatic moment or revelation, but in what it revealed about the nature of Cold War intelligence work and about the human costs of espionage. Both Coplan and Gubitchev were, in their different ways, ordinary people who became involved in extraordinary activities. Both made choices that seemed justified by the logic of their respective systems and convictions. Both faced consequences, immediate for Gubitchev, protracted for Coplan, that extended far beyond what the specific acts of espionage might seem to warrant. The case reminds us that espionage is not simply a matter of classified documents and secret meetings, but involves human beings with families, beliefs, fears, and hopes. It involves choices made in specific contexts, with specific motivations, leading to specific consequences that ripple outward, affecting not just the individuals directly involved, but their families, their colleagues, their communities, and sometimes their countries. Judith Coplon was 28 years old when she was arrested on a street corner in Manhattan, carrying classified documents in her purse. She was 89 when she died, having spent more than 60 years living with the consequences of choices she made during a few years in her 20s. And in between, she lost her career, faced 2 criminal trials, experienced 2 convictions and 2 reversals, raised a family, built a life, and maintained to the end that she had done nothing wrong. Whether that final claim represented genuine belief, necessary self-deception, or simply the position she felt she had to maintain, is a question she took with her to her grave.